the $6 weapon that outlasted jets, tanks, and battleships. Opening hook. At 4:30 in the morning on the 7th of March, 1943, Lieutenant Reginald Ashworth crouched in knee-deep freezing water off the coast of Tunisia, wrapping fisherman's wire around a biscuit tin filled with gelignite. Above him, on the deck of motor torpedo boat 67, his commanding officer was asleep in his cabin, which was fortunate because what Ashworth was doing would likely get him court-martialed. The German supply convoy was due to pass in 90 minutes. Intelligence suggested 3 cargo vessels, heavily laden with fuel and ammunition for Rommel's Africa Corps, escorted by at least 2 destroyers. Standard Royal Navy protocol demanded that MTBs engage with torpedoes from a distance of 800 to 1,000 yards, expensive temperamental weapons that cost 2,000 pounds each and had been missing their targets with alarming frequency in the shallow coastal waters of North Africa. Ashworth had a different idea. It cost £6 and 12 shillings. The metal was cold enough to sting his fingers through the canvas gloves. He worked methodically, testing each connection, making certain the detonator sat snug against the explosive. Around him, 3 other crewmen worked in silence, assembling identical devices. Nobody spoke. If Lieutenant Commander Farnsworth woke and discovered what they were preparing, the operation would end immediately. What Ashworth was building had been explicitly forbidden by Naval Command 6 weeks earlier. Too crude, too dangerous, beneath the dignity of His Majesty's fleet. But in the previous month alone, British MTBs in the Mediterranean had fired 47 torpedoes at enemy shipping. 11 had struck their targets. 11. Meanwhile, men were drowning. The supplies those cargo ships carried were extending the North African campaign by weeks, perhaps months. Every failed torpedo meant another convoy reaching port, another battalion equipped, another week of war. Ashworth had stopped sleeping properly after the disaster at Sfax, where he'd watched a perfectly aimed spread of 3 torpedoes pass harmlessly beneath a German freighter in water too shallow for the weapons to arm themselves. He finished securing the wire and lowered the device carefully into a canvas bag. The biscuit tin clinked softly against its companions. Ashworth checked his watch. 4:52. In exactly 3 hours and 8 minutes, if everything went according to plan, he would either prove that centuries of naval warfare doctrine could be defeated by tinned goods and fishing supplies, or he would be facing a court-martial for wasting explosives and endangering his crew. He looked east, toward where the convoy would appear. The Mediterranean was black and calm. Perfect conditions. This was going to work. It had to. Backstory: Reginald Ashworth learned to fish before he learned to read. His father ran a commercial fishing operation out of Lowestoft, on England's eastern coast, and by the time Reggie was 7, he could splice wire, set drift nets, and identify every species of bottom feeder in the North Sea by touch alone. The work taught him to solve problems with whatever materials were at hand. When a winch cable snapped 15 miles offshore, you didn't sail home for replacement parts. You improvised. His father had a particular contempt for expensive solutions to simple problems. When a manufacturer tried to sell him a patented automatic net retrieval system for £80, the elder Ashworth built his own from scrap metal and bicycle chains for under £3. "Fancy doesn't mean better," he'd say, hammering away in the boat shed. "Means you've got money to waste." That philosophy stayed with Reggie when he joined the Royal Navy in 1938. He watched sailors struggle with over-tightened bolts using regulation wrenches when a length of pipe for leverage would have solved the problem instantly. He saw mechanics order specialized parts that wouldn't arrive for weeks when the ship's machine shop could fabricate replacements in an afternoon. The Navy was an institution that venerated procedure, tradition, and approved equipment lists. Reggie venerated things that actually worked. His practical bent nearly derailed his commission. During officer training at Dartmouth, he'd been reprimanded for modifying the timing mechanism on a practice depth charge to make it more reliable. The device had worked flawlessly, but he'd violated protocol by altering naval ordnance. His instructor, a commander with 30 years of service, had been blunt. "Lieutenant Ashworth, the Royal Navy does not require your improvements. It requires your obedience." But then the war came, and suddenly obedience without results began to look less like discipline and more like suicide. Ashworth was assigned to motor torpedo boats, small, fast, lightly armed vessels that hunted in packs along enemy coastlines. The work suited him. MTBs were too small and too numerous for rigid oversight. Captains operated with considerable autonomy. There was room for initiative, and there was desperate need for it. Because the primary weapon system the Royal Navy had given them, the Mark 8 torpedo, was failing catastrophically. Problem escalation. The pattern emerged within weeks of Ashworth's arrival in the Mediterranean theater. Motor torpedo boats would intercept German or Italian convoys in the darkness, maneuver into attack position, and fire their torpedoes at targets that should have been impossible to miss. Then they would watch, again and again, as the weapons either ran deep beneath their targets in shallow water, veered off course in unexpected currents, or simply failed to detonate on impact. On the 19th of January, 1943, Lieutenant David Morrison took MTB 71 into an engagement off Lampedusa. His boat fired 3 torpedoes at a German tanker from 600 yards. Textbook approach, perfect angle. The tanker continued to port without incident. Morrison later found his entire crew standing at the stern rail, staring at the wake where the weapons had simply vanished into the dark. "I had to tell them not to waste time looking," Morrison wrote in his report. "But honestly, I wanted to look too, wanted to understand how we could fail so completely." 2 weeks later, MTB 63 engaged a supply convoy bound for Tripoli. 4 torpedoes fired, 0 hits. The German ships didn't even bother to take evasive action. They'd learned that British torpedoes in shallow coastal waters were mostly harmless. Petty Officer James Harding, who'd armed the weapons for that attack, requested transfer to mine-laying duty the following week. "At least mines work," he told Ashworth over drinks at the officers' mess. "At least when we plant them, Germans actually die." The mathematics were damning. In the first 2 months of 1943, British MTBs in the Mediterranean fired 93 torpedoes in combat situations. 17 struck targets. 17 out of 93 meant that every time a motor torpedo boat went into action, it had an 18% chance of accomplishing its primary mission. Fighter pilots with those numbers would have been grounded. Artillery crews would have been retrained, but torpedo technology was expensive and complex, the product of decades of engineering refinement. The solution, according to the Admiralty, was better training and more precise targeting. Ashworth knew that was nonsense. The crews weren't failing. The weapons were. On the 23rd of February, he watched a German cargo ship, later identified as the Leverkusen, carrying 74 tons of ammunition and mechanical parts, sail serenely past Malta after surviving 5 torpedo attacks over 2 nights, 5 different MTBs, 15 weapons, 0 hits. The ship was so undamaged that it didn't even bother to radio for escort reinforcement. 3 days later, Ashworth learned that the supplies from the Leverkusen had equipped the 15th Panzer Division for a counteroffensive near Kasserine Pass. British and American forces took 417 casualties, 109 dead. Ashworth read the casualty reports and thought about those 15 torpedoes. 2,000 pounds sterling each. 30,000 pounds worth of precision naval weaponry utterly wasted, while men died because the tanks shooting at them had ammunition that should have been sitting at the bottom of the Mediterranean. He started sketching designs that night. Official rejection. Lieutenant Commander Farnsworth listened to Ashworth's proposal with the patient expression of a man humoring a subordinate who would soon realize his foolishness. They were standing on the deck of MTB 67, moored at the naval base in Valletta. It was the 28th of February, and Ashworth had requested a private audience to present his solution to the torpedo problem. "Let me see if I understand you correctly," Farnsworth said, examining the rough sketches Ashworth had laid out on a chart table. "You want to replace our Mark 8 torpedoes with biscuit tins filled with explosives." "Not replace, sir. Supplement. For shallow water operations where torpedoes run deep or fail to arm properly. And your delivery mechanism is buoyant mines, sir. We drop them ahead of enemy convoys, already primed. They float at the surface. The ships run into them." Farnsworth set down the sketches. "Lieutenant, the Royal Navy has been perfecting torpedo warfare for decades. These weapons represent the culmination of extraordinary engineering and tactical development. What you're proposing is essentially medieval, floating bombs. Do you understand how that sounds?" "With respect, sir, medieval tactics that work are preferable to modern tactics that don't. The temperature on deck seemed to drop several degrees." Farnsworth's expression hardened. I'm going to pretend you didn't just suggest that Admiralty doctrine is ineffective. These torpedo difficulties are temporary. The weapons are being recalibrated. Training protocols are being updated. What we need from our officers is patience and precision, not desperate improvisations that undermine confidence in our primary systems. Ashworth pressed forward. Sir, I've calculated the cost. £6 per device. We could build 50 for the price of a single torpedo and... Enough! Farnsworth's voice was quiet but final. This proposal is rejected. You will not waste naval explosives constructing these devices. You will not discuss this concept with the crew. The torpedo remains our primary weapon, and I will not have my officers suggesting otherwise. Am I understood? Yes, sir. Dismissed. Ashworth gathered his sketches and walked down to the crew quarters, where Petty Officer Harding was cleaning spark plugs. Harding looked up as Ashworth entered. How'd it go with the commander? Ashworth sat down on a footlocker. He said no. Harding nodded slowly, returning to his work. After a moment he said without looking up, Shame that. Sounded like it might actually work. It will work, Ashworth said. Question is whether we're going to let procedure stop us from trying. Harding set down the spark plug. That's a court-martial kind of question, Lieutenant. Yes, Ashworth agreed. It is. Preparation. They worked in the machine shop after midnight when Farnsworth was ashore. Ashworth had selected 3 men, Harding, who could fabricate almost anything from metal scraps, able seaman Colin Reed, who'd worked in a munitions factory before enlisting, and leading seaman Thomas Poole, who asked no questions and followed instructions with mechanical precision. The design was simple. Take a standard OXO beef stock tin, 7 inches tall, 4 inches in diameter, waterproof lid that's sealed with friction. Fill it with 2 pounds of gelignite, the plastic explosive used for demolition work. Insert a number 8 detonator wired to a contact trigger made from a modified battery terminal. Wrap the entire assembly in fisherman's wire, weighted with small lead sinkers to keep it stable in the water but buoyant enough to float just at the surface. The trick was the trigger mechanism. Ashworth designed it to activate on contact with any solid object moving faster than 3 knots. A gentle wave wouldn't set it off. A ship's hull absolutely would. How sensitive is this? Reed asked, soldering a connection on the first prototype. Sensitive enough, Ashworth said. Don't drop it. They assembled 8 devices over 3 nights. Each one took approximately 90 minutes to build. The components came from various sources that wouldn't be missed. Explosives signed out for training exercises, detonators from the base demolition stores, wire purchased from a Maltese fisherman with whom Ashworth had traded cigarettes, tins acquired from the mess hall supplies. Total cost per device, £6, 12 shillings. On the night of the 6th of March, Ashworth gathered his team in the machine shop. The 8 devices sat in a row on the workbench, looking profoundly unimpressive, like something you might pack sandwiches in for a day at the seaside. Tomorrow morning, Ashworth said, intelligence reports a German convoy will pass 30 miles northeast of here. 3 cargo vessels. We're scheduled for patrol duty in that sector. Commander Farnsworth will want us to engage with torpedoes at standard range. And we're going to do what instead? Poole asked. Both. We'll fire torpedoes to maintain appearances. But before that, we're going to drop these. Ashworth gestured at the biscuit tins. Directly in the convoy's path. 500 yards ahead of the lead ship, they'll steam right into them. Harding picked up one of the devices, turning it over in his hands. The wire wrapping caught the lamplight. If this works, it's going to be obvious we did something unauthorized. If it works, Ashworth said, they'll forgive us. If it doesn't work, we'll throw the rest overboard and never speak of this again. Reed looked at the tins. And if it works too well? If we sink all 3 ships? Then, Ashworth said, we tell the truth. We improvised because the situation demanded it. We saved lives and stopped enemy supplies. We accept whatever consequences come after. They loaded the devices into canvas bags at 3 in the morning, carrying them aboard MTB 67 while Farnsworth slept. Ashworth stowed them in a locker near the stern, covered with tarpaulins and spare life vests. By the time the commander woke at 5:15, everything looked normal. The boat cast off at 5:45, heading into calm seas under a sky just beginning to lighten. Ashworth stood at the rail, watching the water pass beneath them, and thought about his father in the boat shed at Lowestoft. Fancy doesn't mean better. Climax. At 7:23 a.m., the convoy appeared on the horizon, three dark shapes moving in formation, exactly where intelligence had predicted. MTB-67 was one of 4 British boats assigned to the intercept. The others began maneuvering into torpedo attack position. Ashworth had perhaps 10 minutes before someone expected him to do the same. "Poole," he said quietly, "get the bags." They worked quickly. The canvas bags came up from the locker. Ashworth opened the first one, checking the device inside. The wire felt stable. The detonator was secure. He calculated the convoy's speed at 12 knots, distance now 4,000 yards and closing. "We need to be 500 yards ahead of that lead ship," Ashworth said. Full speed, directly across their path. The engines roared. MTB-67 surged forward, spray whipping across the deck. Farnsworth emerged from the cabin, looking confused. "Lieutenant, what are you doing? We should be taking position for a torpedo run." "Will do, sir. Just moving to optimal range." The German ships were massive up close. The lead vessel was a cargo freighter, riding low in the water with a full load. Behind it, 2 more, equally heavy. Destroyers flanked them at a distance. None of the escort seemed concerned about a single MTB racing across their bow. The British boats had proven themselves mostly harmless. 3,000 yards, 2,500. The speed was perfect. Ashworth made rapid calculations. If they dropped the mines now, the convoy would reach them in approximately 8 minutes. "Here," Ashworth said. "Start deploying." Harding lifted the first device from the bag. Ashworth armed it. A simple twist of the detonator housing. The mechanism clicked into place. The bomb was live. Over the side, gently. The biscuit tin hit the water with a soft splash and immediately settled into a perfect float, the wire keeping it stable, just breaking the surface. Exactly as designed. They dropped the remaining 7 devices in a scattered line across the convoy's path, each one 50 yards from the next. The last one went over at 7:29. Ashworth checked the distance. The German ships were 2,000 yards away, still approaching steadily. "Now we make the torpedo run," Ashworth said, "as if that's what we came here to do." MTB-67 came about. They lined up for a standard attack, loaded 2 torpedoes, fired them at the convoy from 800 yards. Both missed, running deep beneath the freighters, just as dozens of others had done before them. "Bloody useless," Farnsworth muttered. The convoy steamed on. Ashworth stood at the rail, watching. The other MTBs were firing now, torpedoes racing across the water, white wakes trailing behind them. One passed within 20 feet of a German ship and kept going. Another porpoised to the surface prematurely, its gyroscope malfunctioning in the shallow water. 1,000 yards to the mines. The German ships showed no indication they'd spotted the floating devices. 700 yards, 500 yards. Ashworth could see the biscuit tins now, tiny dark shapes bobbing in the swell, impossible to distinguish from debris unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. The lead freighter's bow reached the first mine at 7:36 a.m. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the water erupted, a vertical column of white foam and fire that climbed 30 feet into the air. The explosion echoed across the sea like artillery. The freighter lurched sideways, its bow crumpling inward. Before the spray had even settled, the second mine detonated. The freighter shuddered. Then the third mine, and the fourth. The noise was continuous now, overlapping blasts that sent smoke and water cascading across the deck. The ship was still moving forward under its own momentum, striking mines in sequence like a terrible drum roll. The fifth explosion tore open the hull below the waterline. The freighter began to list. The sixth blast hit near the engine compartment. Ashworth saw secondary explosions as the ship's fuel reserves ignited. The second cargo vessel, following behind, tried to turn. It steamed directly into mine number 7. The explosion took out its rudder. Mine number 8 caught it midship. Both freighters were sinking. Ashworth stood very still, aware that every man on MTB-67 was staring at him. Farnsworth had gone completely white. "What?" the commander said, his voice barely audible over the sound of burning ships. "Did you do?" Investigation. The destroyers didn't pursue. They were occupied trying to rescue survivors from 2 cargo ships that had gone from operational to doomed in under 3 minutes. The MTBs withdrew, regrouping at a rendezvous point 12 miles south. By the time they reached Valletta, an investigation was already underway. Intelligence officers boarded MTB 67 before the crew had even disembarked. A captain from Naval Ordnance, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles named Patterson, went directly to Ashworth. "Lieutenant, I need to see your torpedo expenditure reports." "2 torpedoes fired, sir. Both missed. And yet 2 German cargo ships are on the seafloor." "Yes, sir. We were as surprised as anyone." Patterson wasn't smiling. "The German radio traffic we intercepted suggests their ships struck multiple floating mines. Mines that appeared to have been laid very recently, very precisely, directly in their path." "Do you know anything about floating mines, Lieutenant?" "Only what I learned in training, sir. We don't use floating contact mines in the Mediterranean. Too much risk to our own shipping. The devices would have to have been placed manually, immediately before the engagement." Patterson looked at Ashworth very carefully. "Would you like to revise your statement?" Farnsworth stepped forward. "Captain Patterson, I can assure you that my crew followed all standard protocols. If German ships struck mines, those mines must have been what, Commander? Wandered into position by accident?" Patterson walked to the stern, examining the locker where Ashworth had stored the devices. He opened it, found the canvas bags, lifted one up, checking for residue. The silence stretched out. Ashworth waited for the order that would end his career. Patterson set down the bag. "Gentlemen, I'm going to make this very simple. 2 German cargo ships are destroyed. Their cargo will not reach Rommel. That's a significant tactical victory. It would be unfortunate if that victory became complicated by questions about unauthorized ordnance modifications." Farnsworth started to speak, but Patterson raised a hand. "My report will state that MTB 67 successfully engaged enemy vessels using innovative tactics that warrant further study. I will not specify those tactics. I will not describe the weapons employed. And I will not pursue questions that might prove embarrassing to officers who demonstrated admirable initiative in combat." He looked directly at Ashworth. "Do we understand each other?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Next time you want to reinvent naval warfare, Lieutenant, try to do it through proper channels first. Saves everyone a great deal of paperwork." Patterson turned to leave, then paused. "Although, between us, I'm curious what those devices cost to build." £6, sir. Approximately." Patterson laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. £6. Christ, we spend more than that on tea for the officers' mess." He shook his head. "Carry on, Lieutenant." Spread and validation. Word traveled through the MTB fleet within days. Officers who'd watched Ashworth's engagement wanted to know what had happened. Ashworth showed them the diagrams. Within 2 weeks, 5 other boats had constructed their own versions of the floating mines. On the 21st of March, MTB 94 sank an Italian ammunition transport off Sicily using 7 of the devices. Cost £42. The torpedo attack that would have been required to achieve the same result, assuming it had worked at all, would have cost $12,000. By mid-April, German convoy commanders had begun ordering their ships to reduce speed in coastal waters and post extra lookouts to watch for floating debris. Italian naval intelligence issued a warning about British explosive buoys of unconventional design. The Kriegsmarine started assigning additional escort vessels to supply runs, pulling destroyers away from other duties. The mathematics shifted dramatically. Before the biscuit tin mines, British MTBs in the Mediterranean were sinking an average of 2 enemy vessels per month. After April, that number jumped to 11 per month. The mines didn't replace torpedoes entirely. In deep water, the traditional weapons remained necessary, but in the shallow coastal zones where most convoy interdiction occurred, Ashworth's 6-pound improvisation was devastatingly effective. Lieutenant Morrison, who'd watched his torpedoes fail at Lampedusa, sank 3 German freighters in a single night using the mines. "I finally got to tell my crew something worked," he wrote to Ashworth. "Do you have any idea what that means? To tell sailors that the weapon they're deploying will actually function as intended?" The German response came in May. Supply convoys began traveling in groups of 6 or more, with minesweepers preceding them. The additional ships required for these expanded operations strained German logistics, forcing them to pull patrol boats from anti-submarine duty in the Atlantic. British intelligence estimated that the indirect impact of the mines, the defensive reallocation of German naval resources, was saving roughly 6 Allied merchant vessels per month. By June, British MTBs had deployed over 300 of the improvised mines. Cost £1,800. Confirmed sinking 23 enemy vessels carrying fuel, ammunition, and supplies that never reached Axis forces in North Africa. The official torpedo program, meanwhile, continued to fail at approximately the same rate as before. Reluctant recognition. In late June, Rear Admiral Sir Thomas Hutchinson visited Malta to inspect MTB operations. He was a career officer who'd commanded destroyers in the First World War and had little patience for what he called garage mechanics playing at warfare. His inspection tour included a mandatory meeting with officers who demonstrated irregular tactical innovation, which meant Ashworth. They met in Hutchinson's temporary office, a cramped room overlooking the harbor. The Admiral was reading a report when Ashworth entered. "Lieutenant Ashworth, sit down." Hutchinson didn't look up. "I've been reviewing your service record. Commendations for courage, reprimands for unauthorized modifications to equipment. A rather mixed picture." "Yes, sir. This floating mine program of yours. Do you understand how profoundly irregular it is?" "I do, sir." "Do you understand that if even one of these devices had detonated prematurely and killed British sailors, you would currently be in prison awaiting court-martial?" "Yes, sir." Hutchinson finally looked up. "Then explain to me why you proceeded anyway." Ashworth chose his words carefully. "Sir, men were dying because our weapons weren't working. I believed I could solve that problem. The risk seemed acceptable." "The risk seemed acceptable to you," Hutchinson repeated. "Not to your commanding officer, not to Naval Command, to you personally." "Yes, sir." The Admiral sat back in his chair. "You're either remarkably brave or remarkably arrogant, Lieutenant. I haven't decided which." He tapped the report. 23 enemy vessels destroyed. Thousands of tons of supplies prevented from reaching Rommel. It's effective. Irritatingly, undeniably effective. Ashworth said nothing. "Here's what's going to happen," Hutchinson continued. "You're going to train other officers in the construction and deployment of these devices, properly, with safety protocols, with documentation. This program will remain unofficial. I'm not about to tell the Admiralty that our most successful weapon system this year was invented in a machine shop using biscuit tins, but it will be organized. Yes, sir. You will not receive a commendation. You will not be promoted. Your personnel file will contain no record of this conversation. But you will continue doing what you've been doing, and other boats will continue benefiting from your work. Am I understood?" "Perfectly, sir." Hutchinson stood, indicating the meeting was over. As Ashworth reached the door, the Admiral added, "Lieutenant, your father was a fisherman, I'm told." "Yes, sir. Out of Lowestoft." "Then he taught you well. Fishermen understand something career officers often forget. There's no dignity in empty nets. Whatever works, works. Dismissed." Legacy. The floating contact mines remained in use throughout the Mediterranean campaign and later in the Pacific theater. By the war's end, British motor torpedo boats had deployed over 2,000 of them, accounting for more than 100 enemy vessels sunk. The total cost of the program, approximately £12,000. The Navy's official torpedo development budget for the same period exceeded $8 million. Reginald Ashworth never received public recognition for his innovation. He wasn't mentioned in dispatches. His name appeared in no after-action reports, except as a junior officer who'd participated in various engagements. When the war ended, he returned to Lowestoft and took over his father's fishing business, running it until he retired in 1972. In 1958, the Royal Navy finally added improvised floating mines to its official tactical manual, listing them as an acceptable supplementary weapon for light attack craft in shallow water operations. The manual made no mention of who had invented them, or when, or why. When Ashworth was interviewed for a local newspaper in 1981, the reporter asked him about his war service. "I did MTB duty in the Mediterranean," Ashworth said. We sank some German ships. It was a long time ago. The reporter pressed, had he done anything unusual or noteworthy? Ashworth thought about that. About the machine shop at midnight. About watching those freighters sink. About Hutchinson's office and Patterson's investigation and Morrison's letter thanking him for giving his crew something that actually worked. No, he said finally. Nothing unusual. Just the job we were assigned. He died in 1994, age 76. The obituary in the Lowestoft Journal described him as a veteran and successful businessman. It mentioned his Navy Cross, which he'd received for general service in the Mediterranean theater.